Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. I finally finished it. Holy hell, was this an interesting book! Before I go into any details, I do want to say, I think this book suffers from a cultural misconception. I was under the impression that this book was a fun, somewhat childish adventure book that is super dated with what is acceptable for heroes to do. And no, that is really not what this book is. This book is a satire that rips apart the nobility, that then transforms into a complex, deeply thought-provoking examination of what is unforgivable, and then becomes an emotional drama, and finally spends a few chapters as a deeply unsettling gothic horror novel. And all of these different genres work so effing well. But before I go any further into this review, I do need to warn you, there are some things in this book which not everyone is going to want to read about, and I'm going to discuss some of them not in super explicit terms. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but yeah, there's a moment in this book that can only be called rape. It is a rape. And I totally understand not wanting to read a book about that, and I totally understand not wanting to watch a review that talks about it. So, if you do want to click away, or want a book that's like this, but, you know, with less of that, I recently read The Element of Fire by Martha Wells, which has a lot of the same flavor, but fantasy and no rape. But now that I have that out of the way, The Three Musketeers follows D'Artagnan, a young man coming to Paris for the first time to make a name for himself. He's 19, he's foolhardy, he's hot-headed, he's occasionally aggressively stupid, and he's dangerously good with a sword. He comes to Paris planning to join the King's Musketeers. He has a letter of introduction from his father that he hopes will earn him a position. But before he even arrives in Paris, he has lost his letter and has found an enemy. Then he manages to get on the wrong side of three of the most well-known and respected musketeers, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. Now, luckily, though duels are often, you know, to the death, people do die in them, somehow they also seem to be a great way to develop friendships. Presuming both parties survive, of course. Soon, D'Artagnan is best friends with these three musketeers, and so when his landlord comes to him begging help because his wife has been kidnapped, D'Artagnan knows he can trust his friends to help him. The woman is Constance, and as soon as he meets her, D'Artagnan falls head over heels in love with her. Ignoring the fact that, yes, she is a married woman. She is a maid waiting on Queen Anne, and through her, D'Artagnan ends up embroiled in court intrigue, the complex, deadly rivalry between the Cardinal and the King, and all sorts of chaos. In this book, there's war, endless romantic entanglements, money troubles, so many duels it's hard to count, and some really dark shit. And through it all, the Musketeers will fight to protect each other, and to a lesser extent, the King and country. So I mentioned this book is very much a comedy in the beginning, and holy hell is it funny! Dumas clearly is very aware of how ridiculous his characters are. He calls D'Artagnan a young Don Quixote in the very first chapter, and in case anyone has not read Don Quixote, yeah, Don Quixote is not a heroic character. He is meant to be ridiculous. He's meant to be sort of, like, romantically ridiculous, like you do feel for him, but he is 110% meant to be a joke. And so, Dumas calling D'Artagnan this really sets us up for the fact that, yeah, the characters in this book are ridiculous. And one of my favorite things this book does is repeatedly, the narration will be enumerating all the good traits of the characters, talking about how smart D'Artagnan is, how wise Athos is, how brave they all are, and then immediately after transition into a moment of them doing the exact opposite of what was just said. There are so many moments where it's specifically talking about, like, Athos, he's calm, he's quiet, he never gets angry and does not talk much, and then we transition to him monologuing. It gets to the point that, like, I honestly started to think that, okay, like, if the book is talking about the fact that Aramis is devout and pious, that means within the next page we're going to have a joke about his mistresses. This is how it works. And this is really drawing attention to the hypocrisy of our main characters, but it's not just our main characters. Yes, D'Artagnan, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, they're ridiculous and often bad people. But so are the king, so is the cardinal, the Duke of Buckingham, like all the commanding officers. Pretty much every character in this book has their worst traits lampooned. There are entire passages about the wise, kind, just king that are immediately followed by the king being an absolute asshole to his wife. And I do think that this was really well targeted. The brunt of the humor is against the powerful, the noble classes, the royalty, and the politicians. They are the ones that Dumas spends the most time pointing out how ridiculous they are, and pointing out how ridiculous the pretenses of their honor was. And Dumas makes fun of the callousness of the nobles, showing us the powerful using the peasants and the servants and even just soldiers as pawns in their games. Even the big war that is fought in this book is not portrayed as being about politics or about religion. It is about the fact that the Duke of Buckingham wants to go get to hang out with the Queen. Like, it is entirely about him wanting to get in her pants. And it's not subtle. There is literally a passage where Dumas is saying hundreds of people are going to die in this war because the Duke of Buckingham wants an excuse to see the Queen, and the Cardinal wants to get between the two of them because the Cardinal wants to fuck the Queen and she's not interested. And one of the most infamous moments in this book, and yes, warning, I'm about to talk about the sexual assault here, D'Artagnan comes to Milady de Winter when the lights are out and sleeps with her while she is under the impression he is someone else. And he has set this up. It is very clear that he actively chooses to pretend to be someone else so that he can have sex with this woman, and this act is deplorable. That is rape. But I think what a lot of the conversations about this moment, at least the ones I've seen, has totally missed, is that the book is very clear that this is unforgivable. Like, Athos, who is himself an ass, and the book directly calls him a misogynist, he calls this act unpardonable. It is the only thing that any of the characters ever ask my Lady de Winter for forgiveness for. It is the only thing that they ever acknowledge they are in the wrong for. And the book really rubs it in our face how horrific D'Artagnan is being in this moment. So there's a maid named Kitty who has fallen in love with D'Artagnan, because everyone does, because he's just so handsome and so young and so virile, and he uses her to get access to my Lady de Winter. And when he is in Milady's chamber, it is perfectly clear that Kitty can hear everything that's going on within. The book directs our attention to her. She is one of the few characters in this book that we are never shown her being ridiculous or hypocritical or callous. She is shown as weeping as D'Artagnan is in Milady's room. She is the reader's stand-in in this moment. She is the person we are asked to empathize with, and she is broken by this moment, and she almost has her life completely ruined by this moment. It's very clear that he uses her and abandons her, and the only reason she is not horrifically punished by this woman, who we know is a murderer, is because she runs and begs D'Artagnan for help to get out of Paris. And he makes a serious turn after that moment. And even though the book never directly says it, I really do think saving Kitty was the first step on him becoming less of a monster. And I do think Dumas was doing something really, really interesting with all of this. There are plenty of moments in this book when one of our heroes does something that they treat as perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable. Of course I killed that guy for looking at me funny, no biggie. And then they treat almost the exact same act as utterly unforgivable when someone else does something similar to them. And usually it's not as big as killing people. Usually it is something like, oh, that guy cheated at dice, let me go cheat at dice, that sort of stuff. But there are moments when our characters directly talk about what is and is not pardonable as well. And my theory is that this entire book is one that Dumas wrote as an examination of what we are willing to forgive in our friends that we would never forgive from a stranger or an enemy. Athos calling D'Artagnan's actions unpardonable comes literally a few lines before he declares that he will do anything, he will die to protect his friend. And I think the reason the book starts as a comedy is because in a comedy, we as readers are more likely to forgive and even appreciate things that we would not forgive in a drama. As long as it's funny, we tend to find bad actions endearing in comedy. Like, yes, even though I know it was horrible to for the poor peasants who might have had their literal livelihoods ruined, Athos barricading himself in the cellar and getting rip-roaring drunk and then refusing to pay for everything he ate, drank, and ruined, yeah, because it's funny, it was sort of charming. Even though, yeah, if you look at it from the peasant's point of view, this moment is horrifyingly bad. And I think part of the reason the book is so funny in the beginning is so that we will get attached to these characters without ever really thinking they are good people. We know they are that friend that you hang around because their stories are hilarious, but you don't want them anywhere near your actual life because they'll probably steal your wallet, seduce your girlfriend, break your couch, call you names behind your back, and get you fired. They are bad people who you enjoy being around. And then Dumas hits you with the unforgivable crimes. Some spoilers here. Athos tries to kill his wife because he thinks she was a thief. D'Artagnan rapes my Lady de Winter. Porthos and Aramis are honestly a lot less horrific, but they're also less important characters here. Porthos basically is just a gigolo who practically extorts a woman out of the money he needs for his supplies, and Aramis is only interested in religion when he thinks his mistress has forsaken him. These are both false, but they are not nearly as bad as Athos and D'Artagnan. And all of their crimes are openly addressed. Dumas calls our attention to these crimes. On page 494, we have this line. Athos has just come face to face with his wife, and we get the line, "He thought how one day, in a situation less perilous than that in which he now stood, he had already sought to sacrifice her to his honor." It is very clear that Athos did not try to kill his wife because he thought she was a danger to society or thought it was his duty. He did it to protect his good name. And then the book turns around and asks us to care about these people's survival. D'Artagnan's life is in danger, and we are asked as readers, do you care if he lives? And what that ultimately comes down to is, do you forgive him for what he has done? Then to make it even more abundantly clear what the book is doing, the narration switches to the story of my Lady de Winter trying to escape her imprisonment in England. And this book is in third person, but it's a pretty close third person, and it's not at all limited. This book head hops like mad. We spend a chapter hearing about one character's thoughts, and then a page hearing about another's, and then a couple pages hearing about another character's, and then we have a paragraph in somebody's thoughts, and then we have like just a line in somebody's thoughts, and then it's a full chapter, and we get to see a lot of different people's perspectives. But the chapters that are focused on my lady getting out of her imprisonment, they're intensely focused on my lady. We almost only hear her thoughts. We get to see her desperation. We get to see her rage at what was done to her. We see her determination to survive. And in many ways, she is a much better hero than our actual heroes. She is intelligent, she is thoughtful, she is talented, she is observant, and she is focused. It's almost impossible not to empathize with her in those chapters. And then she'll think something abhorrent. There's one chapter that literally ends with her thinking basically, I can't wait to get out of here so I can kill a lot of people. And by the end of this section, she is seducing an innocent man into committing a horrible crime for her. And that's when we switch to his POV, so we get to see that painful moment when he realizes he was tricked into killing someone. And like, she's a monster, but she's one that we are asked, can you forgive her? Can you like her? Can you empathize with her? And now that you've seen her at her worst, do you continue to empathize with her? Now, for the rest of the book, when we are in her mind, it's all hate, it's all violence, it's all death. It's pretty clear, yes, the book does not want us empathizing with her in the end, but it gave us enough of her history and enough of her mind that we can't help but see the horror of her death. Spoiler alert, she is executed by our protagonists. But before she dies, the characters say they pardon her. And then they slaughter her and dump her in a river. It is physically uncomfortable to read that section. It reads like a horror novel. And this is all fucking fascinating! There are other things about this book that I just find really interesting. For one, the hands. Oh my god, the hands! Like, several characters are introduced with descriptions of their hands. There's Aramis, who holds his hands up all the time so the blood will rush out of them and they'll stay lily white. There's Constance, who is the picture of feminine, noble beauty, but with hands that reveal her to have done real work. And she is immediately followed by an introduction to Queen Anne, whose hands are perfect, white, and show no signs that she has ever worked a day in her life. Athos identifies My Lady de Winter in the end by her ivory white hands. This book is obsessed with hands, and there's a very clear reason why. Hands are a signifier of class. If you have worked, your hands show it. And Aramis is the one who keeps trying to keep his hands soft and white because he's the one who dreams of giving up the sword and returning to being a priest, whose hands wouldn't be calloused by the sword. He imagines himself more a priest than a musketeer, so his hands must show that. Basically, hands signify where you fit in the social strata. But also, because the hands reveal social strata, they do something else interesting. The only characters in this book who escape without Dumas drawing attention to all of their flaws are Constance, Kitty, and Queen Anne. 3 women in 3 very different stratas of society. All of them express sexual interest in men they are not married to. All of them have their lives turned end over end by men who just can't keep it in their pants. Kitty ends up basically having to be exiled from her home for her own protection. We have no idea what happens to her after she leaves D'Artagnan's field of vision. Spoilers here, Constance dies, and Queen Anne survives. Yes, she is left with a husband who seems to hate her, and a man who she loves has been killed, and she is in constant danger at court, but she survives. This book is very aware that class offers protection. I do also want to say I love the fact that the women in this book are surprisingly powerful. They have agency, they have full inner hearts, inner emotions. Even My Lady Winter, we see the full extent of her soul. They make choices. And yes, they are backed into corners. Yes, many of them are forced to marry men they clearly are not interested in. But they also openly take lovers. They hold the purse strings in the relationships. They are the one that the men have to convince to give money to the men. They run complex court intrigues. Even My Lady de Winter, she's a monster, but she is her own monster. She was never the Cardinal's creature. And in the end of the book, it's said that the Cardinal was actually glad to be rid of her because he was faintly scared of her. And, like, I had been under the impression that Constance was just an object that D'Artagnan chases like prey throughout the entire book, but no! She is completely aware of his interests from moment one. She uses his interest when she needs to. She is actually attracted to him, and it's directly stated that she's attracted to him. She's the one who sets up meetings between the two. She's the one that she does end up as a maiden in a tower, but he is not the knight-errant who rushes to save her. He cannot even figure out where the hell she is until she messages him, and then he has to ask a lot of other women to help him find her. She is brought down by a combination of bad luck and her own willingness to trust other women. And just a quick spoiler here, her death is one of the most painful moments to read in this book. She is a full character, and a lot of the women in this book are a lot rounder characters than I'd expect from an author who was writing in the 1800s. Other than that, I did think the treatment of the servants was actually really interesting. Like, I had heard that the Musketeers are really abusive to their servants, and yeah, there are moments where it's said or implied that they hit their servants, but the servants all have distinct character, and they are all as ridiculous as their masters. but they are also just as humanized as their masters. These are real people with real wants, real desires, and honestly, they had a bigger part in the heroics towards the end of the books than the Musketeers did. They are all full-throated characters, and also there are moments when the Musketeers acknowledge them as, you know, humans, if not equal, at least equally men. So, like, it's not the worst portrayal I've seen of nobles interacting with their servants. Also, this book has a lot that modern readers will probably find themselves skimming over. There's a lot of historical references, a lot of biblical references, a lot of literary references that, unless you are really strongly educated about France in the 1600s, I suspect will go over your head. And, like, at least it did for me. Like, I didn't get a lot of these. But it's also the sort of thing that you can just skim by and ignore, and, like, if you want to really understand every reference in it, you can pause and go look them up. But if you're just reading it for enjoyment, you don't have to go look up what the hell that particular psalm is, or whatever. There's also some bits that I feel like could have been shortened. There's a lot of traveling the same ground when it comes to characters' thoughts, and there's a lot about tracking down money that could have been abridged. Like, I was glad it was there because it did show the mercenary nature of the relationships that a lot of these men had with the women, but some of it just went on a little bit long. And there are moments, especially when it's shifting from comedy to drama, that the tonal shifts don't fully work. One of the complaints, one of the criticisms I've seen of this book is that D'Artagnan basically just gives up on rescuing Constance pretty much as soon as she's kidnapped the second time. And that's not really what happened. He didn't really have any options here. Like, he had no way of finding her. It's directly stated that he looked around Paris for her. He asked people. He tried to track her. But with no leads, there was really nothing he could do about it. And, like, he asks his boss, like, can you do anything? And his boss is like, I'll look into it. But otherwise, there's not really much he can do. And I think the reason that people got the impression that he does just sort of abandon her is because this is a section of the book that's still very much in comedy mode. So D'Artagnan, like, has her go missing, and he's mourning for her and being like, I can't find her, I'm so sad. But we're immediately transitioning back to moments that are full-on just comedy shenanigans. Like, it is just the Musketeers being silly and drinking wine and fighting fights. And that switching back and forth, even though, yeah, the book does go back to it, like, every couple of pages, being like, and D'Artagnan was still missing Constance, but the tonal shifts made it hard to believe that he really was missing her. And I think that has more to do with the fact that the book was switching from comedy to drama in that moment than anything else. Like, the tonal shift just does not work. But overall, I really think this book is utterly fascinating. I find it endlessly ironic that the version I was reading, the copy I'm reading, is called a children's classic, because I cannot imagine giving this book to a kid. It's too complex of an examination of what is unforgivable for most kids to get. And also just, like, the writing is a lot more complex than most kids are going to get, and the endless references to literature and Bible and history, this is the sort of stuff that kids aren't going to be aware of what they can skim and what they can't. Like, this does not feel like a kid's novel. And even if you ignore all the complexities of the moral questions here, then you're left with a silly romp that involves characters doing utterly horrific things. So, like, no, I really cannot imagine this being treated as a kid's book, unless it's heavily abridged, which this version is not. Overall, my impression of this book is that it's a masterpiece. It's complex, it's emotional, it's intricate, with insanely heavy themes. And I don't know about you, but that's just not the impression I was given of this book before I picked it up. I had the impression that it was light, fun, silliness. It was heroic. It was shenanigans. I was picturing it as a little bit like the Pirates of the Caribbean, that sort of silliness. And I think that's a problem, because if you do go into this book expecting a romance, expecting a heroic swashbuckling tale, you're gonna be disappointed. So yeah, read this book. Just know you are getting something far too heavy to be printed as a children's classic.